VikesNow, Dustin Baker. If you're watching a show like this on October 3rd, I'm sure you know the Vikings were triumphant 28-25 in London. They go undefeated in London, 3-0 in franchise history. I guess we're counting 4-0 because in the 80s they played a preseason game there. Unbeknownst to me, the preseason matters sometimes when you're tabulating all-time records. Some Twitter voices were saying, whoa, they're 4-0. All right, so I stand corrected. 4-0 evidently in London, 3-0 in meaningful games. The Vikings go to 3-1 atop the NFC North because of tiebreakers and the number 2 seed in the NFC. If the playoffs started today, the Vikings would host the Green Bay Packers. So I want to go through the items that formulate my take on the win. Tomorrow we'll go through surprising stuff, but today is my generalized reaction to Week 4, Vikings over Saints. Foremost, out of everything, special teams won the football game for the Vikings. They kicked 5 field goals. They were 5 for 5 on field goals, Greg Joseph that is, and that's the first time since 2017 that a Vikings kicker was successful 5 for 5 on field goals. So, for example, there have been times we've gone 3 for 4 for 5 or 3 for 3, but it's the first time they've kicked at least 5 field goals and made them all. I believe it was the Ravens game in 2017 was the last time that happens. There was a moment that was a fake punt where Ryan Wright, a rookie, found another rookie, Jalen Naylor, to extend a drive that resulted in 3 points and a 19-14 lead, and in a game where they got away with kicking field goals when normally you need to score touchdowns, the kicker was perfect. And that means something because you'll recall 2 years ago during the pandemic season of 2020, the special teams was putrid. It's no longer putrid. It got better last year too. And this year it's just continuing from last year. And you don't have these follies. You don't have some moron missing field goals. It's smooth sailing. You can trust the special teams. And if it wasn't for very savvy special teams yesterday, the Vikings would have lost. Now, that couldn't be perfect. You had to have a mixed extra point, which would have forced the Saints to go for a touchdown. So Joseph wasn't completely infallible there. However, he made good on it. He tends to do that. He's a redemptive South African guy. When they needed him to drill that 46-yarder, I think it was, 47-yarder, to take the lead, he did so, and there was no jeopardy about it. It went right through. And then Will Lutz couldn't even hit back-to-back 60-yarders. Now, I can guarantee you when they came back from commercial and they're like, oh, these guys are going to kick a field goal. It's like, well, of course they are, and they're going to make it. I know you felt that way because I felt that way, and bada bing, the Saints made it. Lutz was good from 60. However, when they drew it up that this guy has to hit back-to-back 60-yarders, I'm sure there's some of you that were like, he's going to make this one too. But mathematically, if you're not in Denver, a dude hitting back-to-back 60-yarders, even for Justin Tucker. This is Will Lutz. He's not Justin Tucker. That's pretty rare. I wouldn't expect the Vikings kicker to probably hit either one of those, no matter who it is. But a man hitting back-to-back 60-yarders with the game on the line would truly have been vintage Vikings voodoo. Like, why does this always happen? It didn't, and the team won, going to 3-1 for the season. So here's the deal. That 3-1 is a marvelous record. When you glanced at the schedule or went through it with a fine-tooth comb, if you predicted them to go 3-1 through 4 games, you had high hopes for the team. That happened. They're 3-1. If you're finding ways to not be content with the 3-1 record, then your only goal in life is to bitch. Plain and simple. They're 3-1. They beat the Packers, the Lions, and the Saints. They looked like shit against the Eagles. But anybody that looked down at the schedule with a new head coach and a new defense, a new systemic defense, and thought, oh, if they go 3-1, it's going to be shoddy, and I'm not going to subscribe to that. Then that's just how you are. You just are negative Nancy, and that's fine. But going through 3-1 through 4 weeks is a marvelous achievement for a first-year head coach, and I don't care who it is. It doesn't happen very frequently. Of course, he had a pretty good roster, some of us thought, to work with, and it's coming to fruition. So the grand takeaway about exiting London with the win is that they're 3-1 in a driver's seat to reach the postseason for the first time since 2019, if they don't have a 2016-ish meltdown when they started 5-0 and finished the bitch 8-8. Number 3, it feels like in a miniature way that the Vikings' curses are beginning to melt. They're beginning to lift, no matter which verb you want to use. Now, I'll be the first to say that I don't believe that it's all fixed, but winning these last 2 games, absolute roller coaster games against decent opponents. The Lions are decent. They got this high-octane offense, a defense that can't do shit. And then it's the inverse for the Saints. They didn't have a lot of their weapons, but they do have a good defense. Before the game and after game, the Saints defense is going to be good. Well, when those barn burner games come about, you need some good voodoo. And usually the Vikings don't subscribe to good voodoo. With Kevin O'Connell, so far, they are. When they got their asses beat on Monday Night Football, that didn't involve any voodoo. That was just continued bad vibes, karma, performance on Monday Night Football on the road. But these squeaker games are bouncing the Vikings away. And while they gain their footing early in the season, you can't ask for much more to exit the thing with a 3-1 record. So I say the curses are beginning to lift. The last 2 games easily would have been 2021 losses. Not a knock on Mike Zimmer, but that's how everything happened last year in those types of games outside of maybe the Packers home game. It felt like you get into a game like that, you're going to end up on the short end of the stick. It's not happening in 2022, and that's probably why you have some renewed enthusiasm about this bunch. Another interesting take that I have is that because they've started 3-1, basically winning these last 2 games against inferior opponents, let's face it, all they really have to do, the Vikings, from here on out, the next 13 games, is go about 500. That will get them in the postseason. Ideally, that would be 7-6 at a minimum, because then you're 10-7, and that's, for the most part, 7 teams per conference, a rubber stamp to get into the postseason. And we haven't talked about this in a long time. In 2020, it was started off, 1-3, just trying to get back to where you tread water. And they even did in that season. They got back to 500, and then Kendricks got hurt in 2020. No good. Went down the tubes. And the same thing in 2021. They started off 0-2 with 2 heartbreakers, the voodoo I'm talking about, and they never really recovered, at least to seriously be considered a playoff contender. Just like 2020, they nibbled at wild card status. But now they have this fortuitous 3-1 start. They really only have to go 7-6 the rest of the way. It's, win every other game starting this week. That's how you can look at it. And they'll be in the playoffs. If you're craving playoff football, I know that's wrapping your arms around a wild card forecast. I'm not asking you to do that. But at a minimum is what I'm saying. They have to play 500, and they should be in the dance, depending on what these Packers do. And that's my next point. I've observed this yesterday when the Patriots refused to throw the football with Bailey Zapp at the end of a game. They didn't want to win. They just wanted to hope that the Packers did something stupid and then they could kick a field goal, Nick Folk, and get out of Dodge. Of course, that doesn't win games in 2022, and it probably didn't win games very much in the 70s and 80s. But here's the vibe that I've observed, and probably because of this 3-1 start. It feels like one of those seasons where you're looking at the standings or you're watching the games, and your goal is to catch and surpass the Packers. For 5 years, dating back to 2017, when Rodgers was hurt, it was always, let's see if we can get enough wins to get into the wild card, because the Packers were not going to be dethroned starting in about 2018. And I think the Bears dethroned them in 2018, but it wasn't the purple team. So it has a different aura. Now, of course, one bad loss to the Bears on Sunday would certainly change that. But ordinarily at this point in the season, for the last 4 years or so, you're hoping that the purple team gets enough wins to slide right in underneath the Packers and get into the playoffs. This year, because they don't have Devontae Adams, and let's face it, Packers don't look very good when they're playing. They're just doing what the Vikings are doing, finding ways to win. This feels like a season where the Vikings are reasonably vying for the NFC North. And I don't think you've said that since 2017. So I wanted to point that out, that I don't think the Packers have wrapped up the NFC North. And, of course they haven't, because the Vikings own the tiebreaker, sit atop the division at 3-1, and can get even stronger if they beat the Bears, another division win on Sunday. That'd put them at 3-0 in the division, which is a lovely start. So I think it's neat that you get to, through 4 weeks, believe that the Vikings can win the division because the Packers don't seem as daunting as they usually are as Rodgers winds down his career. Another one. So Kirk Cousins authored second back-to-back game-winning drive, fourth quarter comeback, whatever hell team stat you want to assign to a quarterback. He did that, and that's all really the naysayers ask of him, is they always say, oh, he's got great stats, but he can't win it with the game on the line. Well, he's doing it, and I don't know if that's good enough for you to say, hey, attaboy, or if you're going to start saying, well, his stats suck, but the team's winning. I'm sure that you'll take whatever dialogue is more disadvantageous to Cousins, but he's doing what you asked of him. He's winning football games with the help of a decent defense at times that stands up at clutch moments. It's just that his stats aren't as glorious, but I don't think anybody cares if the team is 3-1. The good news about Cousins, and the whole reason that I bring him up, is that the good portion of his resume historically is on the way. It usually starts sometimes week 4, but emphatically in week 5. If he goes according to his usual production and output, right now, this Sunday is when he gets hot for about 2 months. He always starts slow, probably because he always has a different offensive coordinator. And then in October and especially November, he is at the top of his game. Every season, this is how it goes. And then December hits, and he regresses. That's the bad part of Cousins. It's out in the open. September and December are usually somewhat naughty. October and November are lovely, statistically, and for the team's wins. So, with 5 noon games in a row coming up here, the next 5 games are in that 1 p.m. Eastern or noon Midwest time slot. At 3-1, the Vikings have an opportunity to chip off some wins. They have the Bears, then they probably have the Tua-less Dolphins, get the Cardinals, who look like pretenders, and then Cousins' little revenge game going back to Washington. They have a chance to rattle off several wins and be like something like 6-2 or 7-1 by the time the real opponents start. And by real opponents, I mean the Bills and whatever version of the Cowboys we're going to get. So it aligns nicely with the team that wants to go to the playoffs, that they're 3-1 through some somewhat sloppy football and the good version of Cousins per his historical resume. It's on the way. Now, the defense is still goofy, and that bugs me a lot. I've said to you guys probably about 5 times since the show's inception that I'm a defensive-brained football analyst and fan. That's why I was willing to tolerate the final 2 years of the Zimmer era, because I had faith that he'd restore it. But in both of those seasons, when Danielle Hunter was lost, it was not good. But I still can't get a drop on the way the Vikings play defense. Yesterday during the first half, I think it was their best half of defense. And it felt like, all right, have they figured this out? That you don't have to allow these gigantic chunks of yards to a team. You can be good during the middle of a game too. Well, they did, and then in the third quarter, it was like, all right, let's let the Saints march right back into it, and it was the week 1 through 3 defense that was like Swiss cheese, and then stands up triumphantly with the game on the line. So I really hope that it's just more growing pains from the switch to a 3-4, because if the Vikings defense plays like it did in that third quarter and most of the fourth quarter, then they're not going to be a realistic Super Bowl contender. You can't get to a Super Bowl with just some shoddy defense. It doesn't work. It never works. In fact, the teams with the hot defense in the playoffs and a clutch quarterback are the ones that get to February. A couple final notes here. Thank God the Vikings won, because the Saints were without their QB1, their RB1, their WR1, and their left guard. They did not have Jameis Winston, Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, or Andrus Peat. And for context, that would be like the Vikings facing the Saints, or the Bears upcoming, or the Dolphins without Kirk Cousins, Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, and Ezra Cleveland. How would you feel about going down to Miami with Nick Mullins, Alexander Mattison, Adam Thielen, and my goodness, I don't even know who they would put in. Probably Oli Udoh. or Chris Reed maybe. How would you feel about that formula going to play a team in an unfamiliar environment? Well, that's what the Saints did against the Vikings. So thank God the Vikings won, because it would have been embarrassing for them to lose against the team without its QB, RB, and WR. Yeah, that's what I kept thinking. And, then you lose track of that mindset and you just, thank God they win in general because the game was so emotionally charged. But keep that in mind, that while a win is a win, they really just survived a undermanned Saints team. Use that for context. And finally, what I have is that for the nuance, the perspective, in theory, the Vikings should only get better. You have a first-year head coach, a brand new defense that's been installed, and most of these dudes, just getting acclimated to it for the first time. And, just a season, a new roster in general, that if they are a good football team, they're only going to get better. This 3-1 record doesn't have to be the modus operandi of how everything goes. Teams get better as time goes on. So I think there is just a development process, even for a season, even for a team in a season. It just so happens that the Vikings are 3-1 through the first 4 weeks. So it doesn't feel as dire or urgent that, shit needs to change or shit needs to turn around. I think they have time to grow, especially on offense, avoid some of those nasty ruts where it's like, what are we doing out there? And then defense is a no-brainer that they need to get better. But this isn't a finished product, and few teams right now are. But thankfully, because the team is atop the NFC North, I want to give a cautionary or an optimistic tale that they can get better than this. And if they're going to be better than this, then start imagining what their ceiling can be when they play the Bills or they play on Thanksgiving against Bill Belichick, that they're going to need to be better to beat some of those teams, especially the Bills, which I don't think that they'll win even if they're 8-1 by that time or whatever their record might be. All right, so that's my take. It was glorious to come out with a victory of 3-1. If you're mad that the team's 3-1 because they look sloppy while doing so, your only goal in life is to bitch about stuff. One of the biggest things that I mentioned about 5 minutes ago was that the NFC North seems attainable, and we haven't felt that way since probably the start of the 2018 season. I'll be back tomorrow with some of the surprise stuff from inside the game that I'll lift up, and that's all I got. Skol, baby.